Mathematica has been in place in the museum here in Los Angeles for about 10, 12 years. The house was built now just about 25 years ago.
I don't think it's changed. People who come and visit it have noticed it's changing, things growing more, but I think we just settle in and not look at it. We've lived in the house since 1948. I think we moved in on Christmas Day.
We had originally, in a way, planned to build a house in Santa Monica, right in the heart of the city, more or less a walled-in situation, because we liked the idea of taking a very anonymous kind of spot right in the city, building a high wall around it, and create, almost like in the Spanish tradition, a house where you opened a small door and it expanded out and up to the sky. And so what happened, why, that plan was immediately shot down because we discovered what was a marvelous site here. I mean, how many places this close to the city where you have like 4 acres? We hawked everything we had in order to make the down payments on the land because it was a remarkable thing.
Spent all our spare time here. Began to think it would be a criminal to put that house in the middle of the field.
The meadow became the thing to maintain, because normally the meadow is the site. We've seen so many pieces of architecture which started as a beautiful site, and you put the building on it, there's no longer a site. So we left the meadow as it is, carved a slot in the side of the hill, and put the house behind this set of eucalyptus trees.
I think I went out to Los Angeles around 1948, maybe 1950, really to see the house that Charles had designed for himself and for Ray. And that's when I first met them. Right after World War II, I think an awful lot of people in this country and around the world were talking about using industrial materials, standard industrial materials, to create a new kind of architecture, prefabricated buildings, prefabricated houses. And what Charles was trying to do there was to take perfectly standard parts out of building materials catalogs and create a completely new kind of environment. And it was done in an absolutely flawless way. No one had done it before. And yet, in this first effort, a really radical departure for home building, if you like, he did such a perfectionist job that it hasn't been equaled since. It continues to be really one of the most significant houses built in this century.
I think he's always been, certainly since I've known him, he's always been using technology. Their house on the cliffs above the sea is a house made largely of standard steel prefabricated parts bought from a steel supplier. Sheet, girdered trusses, you know, those triangle openings, and they're put together in a way that doesn't look at all like a factory shed, but the same materials are in it.
While it is a steel house, why, it has very much in common with a kind of house that you would have built out of raw timber or logs or something, because of the elements all show. It actually did work very well as a system. Interesting thing was that the house that we designed of these materials was entirely a different house. It was a bridge house that sort of went out between these trees that you see here and didn't touch the ground except at 4 points. But when we did that, and the material, finally got a building permit, which was very difficult to obtain and all the material was laying on the site. We said, well, we've done the most minimum house with the most steel that you can do. Let's try to reverse the process, take the material that we have on the site, redesign the building so it uses exactly the same amount of material that's there, except attempt to expand it into the greatest kind of volume with the least material. The fact is that we had to fabricate one bar joist in order to do it. It's like a game building something out of found objects, which is the nicest kind of exercise you can do. I was trained as an architect, but then architecture, particularly at that time, was a great base for many kinds of things. We haven't left architecture because architecture, it exists whether it's in film or in the exhibitions or concepts, ideas of any sort. I think it's architecture. That's what we draw on all the time.
Ray, what was your background?
I had been trained as a painter and worked with Hans Hofmann for many years. But again, when we were working on the furniture and on the house and again in film, it never seemed like leaving painting in any way because it was just another form.
But never consider going from architecture to furniture, for example, as a break in continuity, because a piece of furniture is just architecture at a smaller scale. And even as far as Ray is concerned, the piece of furniture is just like painting, an organization of the structure of a painting in 3 dimensions. It's the same process.
Nobody had got into mass production with good modern furniture in this country. So I suggested a competition. We were all young architects at one part or another in the country here. We were all very excited about modern furniture. Architects always are interested in furniture. And we had certain examples that we knew about that were already sort of classics. The Mies furniture and some Breuer furniture, it's particularly his first chair, and the Alto stuff, which was single plane bent plywood, and we loved it. It was marvelous, just excellent furniture. And everybody was racking his and her brain to think, what next can happen, And so one absolute major thing was this business of deciding that you could make plywood in 3-dimensional shapes. Okay, that was sort of the technical point. The design point, the artistic point, I will say, is what they did with that idea. And that's what shows here. The sudden complete blending of a brand new idea with an enormous design sensitivity and creative drive that produced a whole new way of making furniture, thinking about furniture, and it's been the most important thing of the century in furniture. There's no question about it. Well, the thing that about comfort in chairs was that that anybody could make a pretty comfortable chair by just padding the dickens out of it. A big padded chair was a pretty comfortable thing, the overstuffed thing. This furniture, as opposed to the overstuffed, the very padded thing, was able, through this molded plywood technique, to come at it through developing a basically comfortable and, let's say, supporting form.
The general misconception about the shape, because when people say shape, and immediately afterwards there was a rash of sitting in a soft material and make a casting of your behind.
Oh,
This
yeah.
will work.
Yeah.
And that isn't true, because it is a non-architectural solution to the problem. Because what the solution really depended on, you've got a certain amount of bulk in your physiology, but there are also a lot of certain points that take stresses. What it really depended was a recognition of this in the molding of the plywood, so it was really
Support.
It was a form that would support, not a form that would completely conform.
Wasn't it you that called attention to the love affair between architects and chairs?
I think that's been a running one.
Practically every one of the major steps of furniture design, especially chairs perhaps, in this century has been by an architect.
One of the aspects of modern architecture that became terribly important in the 20s and 30s, I think, was the sort of articulation of different elements, articulation of structure. So that, for example, in a modern building, you would be able to tell exactly what was holding up what, and what was serving what kind of space. There would be a stair tower, let's say, that would be separate from the rest of the building. There would be structural columns and beams expressed in the facade and so forth. And when you look at the early Eames chairs especially, you'll find that in them again, the different elements are quite clearly articulated. There's a steel, tubular steel or chromium-plated steel support, and then there's a wooden shell, a molded wooden or plastic shell. And then the connection, even the connection between the two is articulated. It's a kind of a rubber pad that holds the two together. So this kind of articulation of structure, which is part of the modern movement, is very evident in all of the Eames furniture.
The idea was to take what happened in these chairs and sort of design a system where they could be produced economically and quickly and with less effort.
Because from the very beginning, even when Charles and Aero were working on the organic competition furniture, it was always thought of as mass production, how to have good quality without being a single one-by-one piece.
Then we came out to California really because we knew no one here. We wanted to work on some aspects of furniture. And
we were living in the village in Westwood Village. And Charles working all day at the studio and, at MGM, the art department, doing set designing, and he really enjoyed that. Oh, so ancient. Looking at, when I think of what, we were in a Neutra apartment, living in a Neutra apartment in Westwood, and we used we had two rooms. One of the rooms we used as our workplace, and that's where we did all the first experiments on plywood. We built the first tool that did the molding, which was so magic. The vacuum chamber of a molding box, we called it. by a magic name. We'll call it Kazam. Saturday night was the night to go shopping, and there was a great Sears store, and it was naturally during the war. Material was very, very scarce, and in order to do anything, we had nothing to start with, so we would go to Sears and look at all the great pliers and wire cutters and clamps, and finding beautiful T-square finally, because they were just not available. Ancient history. There were a couple of sculptures. They were not just done as sculpture as such. It was really a way of testing. So much was learned from those. There were two major pieces. They were attempts to discover as much as we could about the nature of the wood and plywood, how far we could take compound curves, and how much it could be varied in thickness. So we would build up we experimented by, instead of having all layers equal, by introducing tapered layers of the same balanced construction. We could go from an edge that was very, very thin, and then thicken it to be, to have a real mass at one point, so that one edge of the wood would be very thin and another would be quite thick, and how far it could curve.
Then the war came, and while we were interested in furniture, we turned our attention to molded plywood splints and litters, things for transporting injured men, using the same techniques. By that time, we had this little facility going. And that was done while the war was winding down. We developed the pieces of furniture that were shown at the museum in '46.
They had really acquired the knowledge that they didn't have at the time of the competition. And they had, in fact, produced a line of furniture which was now ready to be shown in 1946. So I staged another show.
After the first Eames chair was developed, right after World War II, no furniture anywhere in the world was being produced that wasn't influenced by it.
Just gone through a war, and there was new technology, and you wanted, okay, what is the fruit of this technology? And so we set out in doing the plastic chair, the polyester resin with a fiberglass reinforcement. I think that the particular chair, I guess it was the first consumer use of such a material.
Eames wanted to design furniture, I think, which people could afford. This is a machine age of becoming an electronic one, and these are really products of the machine age. It's machine-made furniture and it's machine-designed furniture. It's not furniture that was designed to be made by hand, which is now being made by machines. Although there's a lot of handwork in some of Eames's chairs, the work is integrated with the machine from the early design stages. The design sort of grew out of machine technology.
But he also basically is an inventor. When he has a goal in mind and there's no machine that lives up to that production goal, he invents the machine. He invents the plastic mold to conform to the kind of chair he has in mind.
There's a thing that you sort of can't lose sight of, even aside from the technique of production, and that is in the general concept and design, because you can do a piece of furniture, or as you can do almost any object, and you can look at it, and it can seem to be quite satisfying. But there are several questions we usually ask ourselves. I know, first of all, we'd say, what would Mies van der Rohe say about it if he looked at it? You'd say then, what would Bucky Fuller say about it? He would say something. But then you'd ask yourself another question. That was, you can stand it now, but could you stand it if you saw 50 in a row? And this is a very brutal question, because very often you can do a thing which will stand up as one of a kind, but God help you if you do more than 5 or 6.
How about 20 in a pile?
Yeah, 20 in a pile.
Anyone making one thing, that's very nice to make one thing, but to be able to keep the quality in mass production, we could easily turn out a nice thing and another and another, but to figure a way that the hundredths and the 500ths and the thousandths would have the original character is the only reason we'd be working so hard.
I'm a real, genuine Middle Westerner. I was born in St. Louis. That's on the banks of the Mississippi. I was born on the anniversary of the Battle of Bunker's Hill, which had its sort of effect. One of the first things I remember is seeing Halley's Comet. Not that I could see it so well at the age 3, but it was sort of important enough because it stopped my mother and my father in the middle of a piano flute duet, and I knew it must be something awesome. My father was quite a bit older than I was, and I thought everybody else had booby young fathers. I had a respectable father, of a very respectable age. Life was sort of good in St. Louis. I worked the normal drugstore thing at 13, and believe me, this is where young boys learn about life. I worked in a steel mill in Illinois at age 14. It sounds now like something very dramatic and some plight that a young kid is. At the time, it was really, really fun. I enjoyed a lot of the mechanical things, and it was then, while I was working in the steel mill, that instead of going to engineering school, why I had, through other things, heard about what architecture could mean. So I went into architectural school.
Is it true that your leaving college had something to do with Frank Lloyd Wright?
Well, at the time I was kicked out of the university, which was the beginning of the second year. It wasn't all that clear, but when many years later they asked me to come back, why the old head of the school, and talking to the school and introducing me, said I had been asked to leave the school because I was prematurely and over-enthusiastically concerned about Frank Lloyd Wright. By the way, I shouldn't bill myself as a genuine Frank Lloyd Wright buff, because while he was a tremendous influence in a way, but that impact was really more an impact of attitude than form, because in about 25, I guess it was, that the Wright biography came out, the autobiography, and all that marvelous schmaltz about Wisconsin and the fields and the weather and the earth and the material. That really got to me. It was really, really great stuff. I went to Stuttgart. At that point, then heard a lot about the Bauhaus and Mies and Corbu and Gropius, all that building. And boy, this is like having a hose turned on you or something. It was a real shock, and I got interested and stayed there for a while. During that period, the very early 30s, Alvar Aalto brought a new kind of life to young architects because he was such an earthy guy, but at the same time terribly meticulous, and he really knew the relationships between nature, material, and the nature of people. When anybody starts to practice architecture the year after the Great Depression, why, it certainly has some bearing on what happens, and we were naturally taking whatever commissions we could get, and we did end up doing some churches, Catholic churches in Arkansas, and in order to do it, we were doing the sculpture, designing the murals, painting the murals, but everyone was doing that. I was invited to Cranbrook by Eliel Saarinen on a fellowship. You know, some schools like Wines have vintage years, and this you couldn't help but feel was a vintage year. The time was remarkable. There were many people. It was a marvelous time, marvelous thing. And of course, that great last of the Renaissance sculptors, Carl Milles, was there, a great romantic. He used to cut my hair. Ray had been a painter working with Hans Hofmann, and then it was the end of the 30s when she came to Cranbrook really to be exposed to architecture, to be exposed to structure in a sense that Hans had taught her in painting. It was there that we met. Ray actually worked on the presentation drawings for the organic competition that Eero and I worked on. And Eero, of course, who was a real star, had lots of competition. But Eero, when we first met, why, I was the young, wise American guy, and Eero was the son of the great master, and so we were naturally immediately suspicious of each other, and that after a few nights of conviviality, why, we got over that. Eliel is a very great teacher. Eliel Saarinen is Eero's father, and Eliel was a great architect. He really drilled in the idea that it was impossible to think of any segment of a problem without involving both the next larger thing and the next smaller thing. Eero and I worked together in his father's office. We worked together in that sense, but we were always in touch. We felt very close all through the rest of our lives. If Eero had an idea that he's going to work on a piece of furniture, he'd like as not call me up in the middle of the night and tell me the idea, because in a sense he was staking a claim for that idea. And I would be sleepy, I'd say, don't tell me, I don't want to hear it, but he'd go on and expand it as though he was sort of laying out the patent application for future uses. But on other things, why, we worked on the Dulles Airport, for example. Then the IBM Pavilion we would have worked on, and Eero died, goddammit.
Tacata for Toy Trains was shot in the studio on the grounds of Ray and Charles' home. They had a lot of trains for years and years and years and years, which just seemed to keep appearing. And one day they became a film. It started by a call from Ray and Charles to come to see some material that they'd been working on. And in their study, on the grounds of their home, they had built probably not more than about a 4-foot table on which they'd taken many photographs of the toy trains. And Charles began to, in his, I think, very inimitable way, to spin out this story. It was a story of this train, you know, that went from point A to point B, and of various adventures encountered in the journey of this train and the people that were concerned with it. I think it was in that film that together we refined a way of working which, of course, composers dream of, to have a scenario for a film and then having the freedom to compose the music away from the film and having the film really edited back to the music.
We shot this film as a toccata, and Elmer composed a toccata for it, so that both visually and musically it has a toccata form. And yet we all together demanded one more thing out of it, and that would be if you would play the score completely independent of the film, would it hold as a piece of music?
Now, of course, you may know that they have a light collection of boats, and I'm waiting for the boats to appear for about 15 years now. As any day we'll get to that.
Toys, real toys in the old sense, are probably less self-conscious than almost any other design product. I mean, this is why in the Toccata for Toy Trains we felt very strongly about the way materials were used, because they were used in such a genuine, obvious, unself-conscious way. Toys are not for children. Toys are really for adults, especially grandparents. In the first 2 or 3 films, I had absolutely no experience cutting, and there was a guy down at Consolidated who was in the 16 department, Ted Fogelman, and while cutting the first ones, I had neither synchronizer nor rewinds, and just scissors, splicers, and glue, and Ted Fogelman on the telephone. For the opening, that I thought more or less you have to have a place where you can recognize where you're going to start out.
You did once talk about the football.
Yeah, it could be next to Soldiers Field. You recognize the Great Lakes.
How did you start making film?
Well, very, very simple, like everything else. His friend Philip and Amanda Dunn went to South America to shoot the Gaucho and left us with a Sound 16 projector, and we didn't have anything to show on it, so we shot the first picture just to see how the device worked. We were making a film which was in itself just an experiment. I mean, just to see what happens when you put motion or ideas on film.
We had the toys, and they were at a scale that could be attacked little by little. So we could pick it up and do a little bit and put these little bits together. Then we did the blacktop.
That was in 1950. Why, that was right here in a schoolyard, and we were interested in laying one kind of variation over another kind of variation and see what the relationships the two would give. And so that was the patterns of water over a schoolyard played on top of the Ladasca's Goldberg variation.
Remarkable things happened to us when the music so beautifully coincided in so many places. That was absolutely thrilling. But then after that, we felt really had to have some discipline and be in control. So that's when we made Parade.
I think there's an intimate relationship between toys and science. It lies in the domain which all architects are familiar with, the domain of model making. People like to see unity, and I think there is a deep unity in the world, and I think probably the work of Charles Eames has an enormous unity of its own, and I've tried to talk about it. Model making, the design of theories, is the same thing as the operation of toys. In fact, toys are models, and to make a toy work, you must know something about the real thing or it won't work. Now, the other side of it is, and I think this goes back to in a way, to the 19th century developers of the early mechanical computers, which look sort of toy-like. They were, after all, they're simulations of how people think and to some extent, how people move and act. And a toy is like that. The jointed mechanical doll. It's a simulation device, and the computer is a simulation device, of course, is one of its main attributes today. I think the interest that Charles has shown in the computer, which long antedates the computer as a big industry. Then he was interested in it because of the theoretical structure, because you could take apart everything that had meaning and form and show it could be made as a simple combination of yes, no, binary choices. That's what the communications primer is all about. It's one of the great ideas of communication theory. And the computer arises from that.
The message being transmitted here may be unlimited in the range and the subtlety of its ideas. Yet the method and the signal are such that they must be fed to the transmitter in a series of positive decisions. The system calls for the key to be either up or down. The code calls for a dot or a dash. The current flows, it ceases to flow, it flows. It is black or white. It is stop or go. On or off, one or none, go or no go, or black or white, as in this small area from a halftone reproduction in a magazine. The press that printed it is capable of printing but one color of ink at a time, in this case black ink on white paper. In order to transmit the image, it had to be broken down to many points of decision, black or white. We know that such a limitation is not at all restricting if enough decisions are made. In this case, 500,000 decided points give fair rendition. 1,000,000 would be better. Conventional printing of color is no different, except that with the added factor of color, 4 times the number of decisions had to be made. One set in yellow, one in red, in blue, and in black. Whenever added factors in a problem are recognized, the number of decisions necessary for the solution grows by large leaps. As theories and equipment and men develop, it becomes apparent that one sure way of handling multiple factors is to build a system that can handle each decision in its time. Men have long known the theory on which complex problems of many factors can be solved, but the number of decisions, the calculations necessary were prodigious. And not until the recent development of the electronic calculator could these areas be touched.
The first film we made on communications is because we wanted to introduce architects, for example, to the idea that there was other ways of organizing material except doing it on a scratch pad and with a triangle and T-square. So we made the film to introduce architects to the idea of information theory and how information of all sorts could be handled efficiently and effectively. We felt very strongly that these were techniques that wouldn't in any way diminish the ingenuity, genius, insights, anything that a talented and a well-trained architect would have, but what it would do, because of the hardcore information, the information that it would help provide and the insights, it would just put him on a higher platform from which to operate, and it would sort of raise the whole level of the problem. As it turned out, the architects more or less couldn't care less, and the Department of Labor, I think, bought 50 prints in one, so you can see where the sympathy lay.
I think that Charles' main interest in life is the projection of concepts and the development of ideas. And I think that Charles uses film as an extension of the process of projection of his concepts and ideas.
We've never used film as an art form. Our commitment has always been to either the process, I'm talking about a process you're investigating, like whether it's the computer or whether it's having other things to do with natural law, or the object. The first commitment is to that, and we just use film as a tool.
Whatever is possible, we use if it makes it clearer.
This is an old story, but it reminds us of the surprises we can get when even a small number like 2 is multiplied by itself many times. King Shahram of India was so pleased when his Grand Vizier Sissa Bendar presented him with a game of chess that he asked Bendar to name his own reward. The request was so modest that the happy king immediately complied. What the Grand Vizier had asked was this: that 1 grain of wheat be placed on the first square of the chessboard, 2 grains on the second square, 4 on the third, 8 on the fourth, 16 on the fifth square, and so on, doubling the amount of wheat on each succeeding square until all 64 squares were accounted for. When the king's steward had gotten to the 17th square, the table was well filled. By the 26th square, the chamber held considerable wheat, and a nervous king ordered the steward to speed up the count. When 42 squares were accounted for, the palace itself was swamped. Now fit to be tied, King Shahram learns from the court mathematician that had the process continued, the wheat required would have covered all India to a depth of over 50 feet. Incidentally, laying this many grains of wheat end to end also does something rather spectacular. They would stretch from the Earth, beyond the sun, past the orbits of the planets, far out across the galaxy to the star Alpha Centauri, 4 light years away. They would then stretch back to Earth, back to Alpha Centauri, and back to the Earth again.
what we have in our machine here is a soapy solution. And we have different shapes. And there are occasions when people need to know what the smallest area possible for a given shape can be. Do you want to push that button, please? Now watch the triangle. Can you see what happened? The soap bubble is connected in the middle. Now see, the other one is showing the smallest surface area that can be done on that particular shape. And back here, there's a cube, and it does the same thing, and you'll see a demonstration of what we talked about there. There, yeah.
Mathematica it's been in place in the museum here in Los Angeles for about 10, 12 years. The show is old, but the audience is new. And when Ray and I, a few weeks ago, ran into a graduate from Caltech who had mastered in pretty highly disciplined mathematics, and we found that he was first introduced to mathematics at Mathematica. It made us feel both old and good. Good and old.
Hold your hand. Now when you come down to the eyepiece at the end and look at the same display, it looks very, very different. This is true of all the things here. And this really means that what you see depends upon your point of view.
My head. I feel like I'm my head's in two parts. I feel like I'm bouncing. It's like I ate a hot dog that's too long for me. I'm balancing myself.
Almost everything Charles does works at several levels. This fun mirror is a good example. Children have as much fun with it as we do, and yet you can come in here with a mathematician and show exactly why that fun mirror belongs here and why it is connected with some central concept. He had that thing sitting around in his lab for a while and finally asked whether it had anything to do with mathematics, and of course it does. It homes right in on topology and distortion that preserves some of the structure and so on. 1 point on you, the tip of your shoe, goes into 2 points in the image. And this brings you into the idea of mappings that are not one-to-one and all kinds of goodies that are very important in modern mathematics.
During the development of it, Mathematica, where we had this history wall that is a graphic chart of the lives of mathematicians since the 10th century, why, it was Ray Redheffer that wrote the biographies of the mathematicians.
You watch the arrow carefully and see if you see it cross an edge.
He did the same thing with this Möbius band over here. That was sitting around a long time.
Why was it sitting around?
He had it sitting around because he has a very unusual insight. He knows the right thing to have sitting around.
Now this is like a mechanical rendition of the solar system. And those balls represent some of the planets.
Here at Mathematica, many of the things you see really have nothing to do with numbers.
That one's gonna go in. I think it's gonna take a long time. This is neat.
They have to do with concepts, they have to do with modeling, and they have to do with methods and processes that don't essentially involve numbers.
Now our multiplication cube lights up a lot of numbers. Say you have a cube about geometry that is 5 feet on the side. We'll light up the whole thing, and you can see how many lights we have.
After Mathematica, we realized that there were sort of a lot of things that weren't quite said, and one of them was sort of the some insight as to what the tremendous range from the very small to the very large was, because we felt that people today, as never before, they're faced with using these things even though they can't sense them. And about that time, a great teacher in Holland, Kees Burke, had written a book called, published a book called The Cosmic View, which was a very great and insightful sort of thing. What we were trying to do was to make clear, to give a sort of a down-to-earth gut feeling of what it meant for things to increase in an exponential rate.
We begin with a scene 1 meter wide, which we view from just 1 meter away. The sleeping man is having a picnic on a Miami golf course. As we back off, the clocks start, and we accelerate in such a way that after 10 seconds have elapsed, we will be exactly 10 times farther away. Now the scene is 10 meters wide, and in 10 seconds it will be 10 times that wide. The sleeping man is still in the center and will remain there long after he is lost to sight. After the second 10 seconds, the square we see is 100 meters wide, the distance a man can run in 10 seconds. Now a kilometer, 1,000 meters, the distance a racing car can drive in 10 seconds. The picnic is about lost as we begin to see Miami Beach. 10 to the 4th power, 10,000 meters, the distance a supersonic aeroplane can travel in 10 seconds. 10 to the 5th power, a 1 and 5 zeros, the distance a satellite in orbit can cover in 10 seconds. Our speed is growing at a tremendous rate. In these past 10 seconds, we will have covered almost 1 million meters. The Earth, that will be all but gone in about 20 seconds, looks solid and imposing and remarkably spherical. 10 to the 7th, our speed is now about 2 million miles an hour, 0.3% of the speed of light and growing fast. A beam of light on the same plane as Earth would travel this far in 1 second. We can now see the orbital path of the moon around the Earth. As our speed gets to be a substantial percentage of the speed of light, it has an effect on our time scale. What seems a normal 10 seconds to us would be a much longer period in relative Earth time. Our clocks are getting out of synchronization. Now a long time elapses on Earth for each 10 seconds of our traveling time. The clock is spinning round. The light from the sun appears, and parts of the orbit paths of some of the planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars. 10 to the 12th, considerably farther away is the outer group of planets, so that we now see our whole solar system.
That film is so beautifully visualized, and in addition, it has this strong but not, what shall I say, not imposing theoretical framework with the dashboard on the left of the screen, so you can orient yourself, say how fast you're going. That's a remarkable idea, you see, that it puts you into the position of a rider in some marvelous spaceship that can't be invented.
The trip back to the picnic on the golf course will be a sped-up reverse version, reducing the distance to the Earth's surface by 1 magnitude every 2 seconds. Every 2 seconds, we will appear to cover 90% of the distance back to Earth. We notice the rhythm of change between periods of great activity and relative inactivity that will continue all the way down to our next target, the nucleus of a carbon atom just beneath the skin on the hand of the sleeping man at the picnic. Ten to the 9th meters, and to the 8th, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are back at our starting point.
No side tours, no looks back, nothing of that sort. Just the pure exponentiation. Times 10, times 10, times 10, times 10, inevitably carrying you from your own hand to the depths of the universe. I think it's just a wonderful sweep to it.
Philip Morrison, at that time, was in the Commission of College Physics. He gave us advice and counsel on some of the interpretations of the first stab at powers of 10, And there were a lot of subtle points and a lot of beautiful points that he contributed.
Of course, I knew and admired Charles Eames before I really acquired a serious interest in innovation in science education, which is one of the things I've been trying to do for some years. But when I finally realized that we were doing such a bad job of education in science, and the public did not understand science, and our students didn't really understand science except those that somehow or other got across some barrier, and then it was fine, I recognized that the kind of path to take people across that barrier was maybe being provided by Charles Eames, who produced science, good science, as I've tried to argue, carefully thought through and analyzed, but in a form so beautiful, so elegant, so compelling because of the way it looks at the thing, that many more people could perhaps be brought to look at it that way. And I think that's the main thing that I've learned, that we must have a much freer and a much, to use the word, a much more artistic view of how we teach people science and how we write the books and produce the films and make the apparatus. Think about how it looks. Think about whether it's beautiful or not.
There seems to be a general assumption that science and art form a kind of a discontinuity, and I don't think anything could be farther from the truth. When a poet, for example, views two entirely different things, seemingly have no relationship, but builds a beautiful simile out of it, it's exactly the same as when a scientist, Newton, for example, when he saw the moon and he saw the apple fall, two seemingly unrelated things in which he built one of the most exquisite theories, principles of all time. I mean, if you were to write a job description for the best scientist in the world, why it would run something like this. It would be someone who could look at a state of relationships that were seemingly chaotic, and by studying them long enough, come upon functional relationship between the parts, and as a result of study of that, build a structure, and from that structure arrive at a premise which he then puts into action. Now this kind of a description of talent would be the exact description that you would write for an artist, for a politician, for a newspaper editor, for a filmmaker, or anything. The continuity is absolutely complete.
He gave me a print of one of his most beautiful films, very simple film called Tops. And I have an astronomical theory which involves spinning objects on a gigantic scale, galaxies. And every time that I give some scientific talk to professional astronomers and physicists about the nature of the theory, I show this film as sort of a dessert at the end, saying, look, tops are all the same, big and little. They all behave in a certain way, and here's a film that makes it very clear. Though all these people know about tops, the fact to see it realized in all those many forms gives a kind of richness to the idea, which I think adds a good deal to the equations and the detailed argument that we've presented. there's this quality of, if I can use the word, of a kind of love for the world, the way the world is. And that same concern for what the world is made out of, I think, motivates, in some deep way that they don't really want to describe or think about in their daily work, most people who went into science.
Two, three, cut. I suppose real honest-to-God cameramen feel that if you're once a still photographer, you're always a still photographer, and you're just doing it in motion pictures. I don't quite believe that, but there's probably, that's true to some extent. Well, I've shot almost all of it, because you're not going to let somebody else have all the fun. I started shooting stills when I was very young. My father, he had done a lot with cameras while they were still fairly new, and so he had a lot of material. And when he died, I was about 10, 11 years old, and he left a whole cache of material, which I found. I was sort of an avid instructions reader, and started using the stuff. And well, I had been taking pictures of my friends for a greater part of a year before I discovered that Eastman had invented film. I'd been doing it all on wet plate. See, we use photography just like you'd use any tool. It's something that applies to almost anything that we do. It becomes an extension of it. If you're talking about one subject, naturally you can get a lot more information in a series of shortcut stills than you could in one pan shot. But there are other things I think that a still can do. They still can get a kind of mood where you sort of capture the thing and you immerse yourself in it. And even the forms have a different effect on you emotionally than a piece of motion picture where you're anticipating subtle changes within the picture. That doesn't mean to say that one's better than the other. It's just a difference. Survived that one again.
Yes, at least the columns came on together.
Right.
You seem to particularly enjoy doing multi-screen projection films. Why?
Yeah, what it really ends up being is a great invention. It's an invention that sort of allows you to show more slides to an audience in 5 minutes than they've ever experienced before. It's just, it's an outlet for a picture-taking maniac.
Had you done any multi-screen films before the Moscow Fair?
Oh, certainly. There were our own experiments, but I suppose one of the first real ones was the sample lesson.
Rough sketch of a sample lesson for a hypothetical course.
It's interesting, and thinking about it also, that it was a form of report originally.
George Nelson and Alexander Gerard and Ray and myself had been asked by the Rockefeller Foundation to make a study of this problem. That is, to deliver as much information to a class as we could in 1 hour. Because we also found that the amount of information people could take in, particularly image-wise, was much greater than they were usually offered. Not only was there multiple screen material, but there was a highly controlled amount of sound, and also a program of smells that were synchronized with the images. And we had something like 6 smells, and Sandro Gerard masterminded the smells. He's somewhat of a smell authority. The Moscow thing had to make sense in delivering of a message to one urban community to another urban community that had their fill of talk and words ceased to mean something. But pictures still meant something. And to make that work, well, we had to pull together a lot of pictures at a time.
In summer of 1959, there was this first very large U.S. exhibit in Moscow, in Sokolniki Park in Moscow. That was the exhibition that Nixon opened and where he had that kitchen debate with Khrushchev. The U.S. Information Agency had decided, for some reason which wasn't clear to anyone, to build a huge Buckminster Fuller dome at the entrance to the exhibition. And having built this dome, they then had to decide what to put into it. And someone came up with this brilliant idea of turning the whole problem over to Charles and Ray. Well, Charles and Ray said that they would be producing a movie, which I think was to be 13 minutes long, which would describe a typical day or a typical work day and a typical Sunday in the life of American families. They specified that there should be 7 screens, very large screens, suspended inside the dome, and there would have to be 7 projectors, each set up very precisely on a different angle on a kind of concrete ramp. The dome was finished, and the projectors were in place, and everything was ready, but there was no film. And it was about a day or 2 before the opening. And all of us were having a sort of collective nervous breakdown because this was going to be a total disaster if there was nothing to show inside this huge dome. When all of a sudden, I think it was the night before the opening, practically, we were standing in that dome, and all of a sudden, out of the dark in Sokolniki Park in Moscow, came Charles and Ray, dressed like a Boy Scout and a Girl Scout, and carrying a sort of canvas bag with all the cans of film in their bags. We put them into the projector, and it was absolutely perfect. There was not a single hitch. It was absolutely flawless. And I don't really know much about how to make films and so on, but it seems to me that making a totally new kind of presentation, 7 screens, 7 different reels, completely coordinated, often interchanging, often sort of running from one screen to the next and so on, and doing this in Venice, California, on a tiny little mock-up of the whole thing, and then bringing it to Moscow, putting it into projectors, and then having an absolutely flawless performance right off the bat. Well, I don't know anyone else who is capable of doing that in any field. And it impressed all of us, and it impressed all of us who were there, and we remember that moment, I think, we will all our life. I think that when Khrushchev saw it, I think he was really stunned. What Charles was trying to do was to give credibility to the story of life in America by having the same kind of scene repeated 7 times on 7 screens in different parts of the country. People going to school, people going to work, people going to the races, people going to the movies, going to church, and so on. And all of these scenes were perfectly ordinary events in daily American life. And by simply presenting them again and again on separate screens, he added a degree of credibility which I think would not have existed if this had been a single screen presentation.
And the thing was so moving in his orchestration of forms and colors and sounds that I thought it was incredible to me that anybody could have been master enough of those frames to make this whole thing really work together like orchestra instruments. And finally, when you get through, the Russians standing there, it was a universal language of everyday life of human beings. And when those 1,500 people who were standing there finished their 20 minutes or half hour, what it used to take, you just watched them coming out. Everyone of them had tears in their eyes. They felt so extraordinarily simpatico with those other human beings, this other part of the planet. There was nothing to do with nations anymore. It was really human beings with human beings. And Charles had a genius that manifest there that was really of the very greatest order.
I think it worked exactly as we hoped it would, in that they didn't have time to think about it, but they felt, and you could tell exactly that they were getting. They were not thinking about it because they were not reacting as written, but purely emotionally, and recognizing things that we hoped they would recognize, and similarities between us, and even recognizing our feeling, I think, about
Ray, there was an official idea of what the ending should be, which consisted of flights of jets and a fanfare. But Ray had a different idea of an ending. She was to end on a ratty little bowl of forget-me-nots. And so we did. Film,
very quiet and beautiful.
Then came a piece of fortune where the Russian word for forget-me-not is actually the same as ours, forget-me-not. So that at the end of the film, there'd be these huge crowds, and there was this little funny forget-me-not bowl, and the word would go through the whole place. You'd hear them say, Nezabutki, Nezabutki, Nezabutki.
And they'd turn to each other and
it was really very nice.
When you go into Charles's studio, he has all these aquariums, and there are kind of all kinds of these tanks with these beautiful creatures all around, swimming around, developing shark fetuses and beautiful sea anemones.
It's a little hydra medusa which was caught in a net off Santa Monica, but it's an animal about 3/8 of an inch high, and what you'll see now is a view of it. In terms of the office, the tanks have gotten to be kind of ancient history. They were built naturally to house the animals, and the animals are here because with Kevin Roach and office of who was really the successor to Aero, why we were asked by the Department of Interior to do a national aquarium, is to write the program for and do an aquarium.
The story we heard was that a rather august senator was walking through the halls of the Capitol one day, and he found a mother helping her child to use the back of one of the columns as a toilet. And so he went right in there and then said, we need more. What we need in Washington is a lot more places for people to go. He said, what about an aquarium? When we started on it ourselves, we thought that, well, it's obviously something like this is not just a bunch of fish tanks. It's not a sea circus. It is a national aquarium. It has all kinds of responsibilities other than above just the showing of the animals. And we started work, well, really, Charles started work by creating a program, and he did that by speaking to all of the marine biologists that he could get to listen to him or that would speak to him. He did an enormous amount of research, traveled extensively, and got into the whole problem in such tremendous depth that by the time, at the end of a year, he probably knew more about marine biology than most of the marine biologists that he had spoken to.
And one of the things that became apparent was that most of the aquarium sort of showed relatively large animals, and because there was so much interesting stuff took place at a very small scale, why we used the tanks in order to find out how we could show organisms at a relatively small scale that in a way seemed to hold more information than even the larger ones.
And once you saw these small little animals and seeing them on the screen and seeing them in photographs that were very large, then you could see them with your naked eye.
Say once a week or once a season, something interesting happens, but nobody's going to be around a tank and watching that fascinating thing happen. However, if we could capture it on film and be able to show it in relationship to the animals themselves and also show ways of looking at them very close, why, it added an awful lot, we felt, to the aquarium.
The film was made really as an idea to put the statement on record with the intention of this institution.
There are several minor orientation theaters. One on locomotion, the universal problem of how to get around. It suggests that all the specimens in the aquarium could be studied from this particular point of view. Our perception, the smell, the taste, the senses by which aquatic animals perceive the world around them, the kind of signals they receive, the world as it looks to them, to a pelagic animal or a crustacean. One would also treat animal behavior with exhibits to illustrate territoriality, schooling, courting, and show these traits as a product of natural selection.
It also had a promotional aspect to it, to show it to members of Congress and other people to stimulate the idea for building the aquarium. And it also had an educational aspect, or let's say an aspect of communicating with the scientific field to reassure them that what was being built here was a very serious, particularly research-oriented facility.
But whenever you enter into a government project, you know that there's a high risk that the thing will never come through. The more expensive it is, the greater the risk. So a thing like the film, this sort of protects you against that, because at least you have a product that is left. And if somebody else does it, if the question comes up again, the film will hold over their heads, will haunt them to the end of the project, because if the project falls below the standard set by the film, why, they'll have to answer to it. It's sort of a dirty trick, because after all, it is a film and not an aquarium. We're doing an exhibition that's going to go into Paris at the Grand Palais in 1974. And it's an exhibition on Franklin and Jefferson. And so you have, in a sense, a combination of two individuals that I believe is a much richer show than, for example, if one did it on Jefferson alone. They were both architects in the sense that they were architects of an experiment. And if one does a show about these guys, the question is, at the end of Jefferson's life, would the experiment work and survive the wilderness of the Louisiana Purchase? And today, it's the same question. Will the experiment survive the kind of wilderness that we face today?
The visitor enters the exhibition through an open atrium, a gallery of paintings of the period, the landscape, the buildings, the people. It provides the mood and background against which the action of the exhibition takes place. On the floor of the atrium, there are clusters of small monument-like structures. Each represents one of the special people associated with Franklin and Jefferson.
The aquarium film and the Franklin Jefferson film, these are all models before the fact. An architectural model, and it's sort of a pedagogical model. And you do get the opportunity to then try it out on people, get their reaction before you build the thing.
The model was done for a presentation of what the concept of the exhibit was going to be. What the next step is, it's bringing this whole model to life so that one can physically walk through it and read the material and see what it is.
Is that a step?
That would be a line. Then this would be a highlight across here. And then this would be a right. And this would be a highlight across there.
So this should be less, probably.
Right.
So it's
not as much of a shadow.
Yeah.
And that gets to be maybe even smaller.
Except, but this is a much narrower piece, isn't it?
You know, any profession or any activity has its classic description, which is all goodness and roses. But in practice, in the day-to-day practice of it, you know, there are little stinky problems that must be overcome if the concept is going to survive. And, you know, just before a project is finished, why, Ray and I wonder if we're going to be ridden out of town on a rail. You know, will our friends ever speak to us again?
They're usually broken down as to people.
Some of them seem to be quite late, but I don't think that makes too much difference.
Not at all. I think, for instance, that's very early, you know, has a terrific presence to it.
It's still in Jefferson's lifetime, but it should belong to an earlier epoch.
Yeah, I think. And then there's the things that I love are these things.
Oh, yes,
I expect
the process itself has to be rewarding. I think that Charles tries not to take on any project that won't be rewarding in the process. I think he tries to avoid taking on things that are only means to an end. And I think this is one of the things about the way this office is conducted, that further than you would believe possible, the process itself is made to be a source of pleasure.
And I think this is, in a sense, the objective, to get many of the rewards of life from that work that you do. The kind of pleasures that one has gotten from the arts or looked for should come from the business of life itself. Again, we don't get a chance to do this. When we speak of the idea of taking pleasure seriously, it's not a one-way street. It's not a question of finding just great pleasures in your work. It's also really taking your pleasures seriously. That is, those times that you were out for something just for pure enjoyment itself, in a sense, relating it back to the same kinds of disciplines that you put into your work. And again, so that it feeds back to your work and to your daily experience. It's a happiness from both ends of the scale.
This program has been made possible by grants from International Business Machines Corporation and the National Science Foundation.